You've been told since childhood that history is built on documents, on books, on chronicles, on maps, on those very papers that lie quietly in archives, waiting for a careful researcher to open them. It sounds reliable, even reassuring. But all this certainty rests on one simple condition. These documents must exist. There must be access to them. They must not be systematically decommissioned, hidden, burned, and replaced with new versions of the past. Right where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Now imagine a different picture. You come to a large library, fill out a request form, ask for a book published before the mid-19th century. You wait. And instead of a volume, you get back a short formula. Under restoration. Unavailable. Lost. Transferred to special collections. No clearance. You submit another request, then another, and suddenly you notice a strange thing. The further back in time you try to go, the thicker the darkness becomes. And here is where the most dangerous part begins. Because it's no longer about a missing book or a librarian's carelessness. It's about the possibility that at some point, humanity didn't just lose part of its memory. Perhaps this memory was cleared away, coldly, systematically, almost simultaneously in different countries. And then, on the cleared space, a new, convenient version of the past was built. Today, we will follow this chain step by step, from a rejection in the reading room to the school textbooks that cemented the new picture of the world. It all begins not with a loud sensation, but with a very quiet scene. High ceilings, long tables, lamps with green shades, the smell of paper that's long been absent from ordinary life. The reading room looks like a place where the past should speak for itself. But instead of the voice of the past, you get a slip of paper with a rejection. The book is absent. The edition is under restoration. Access is restricted. Request denied without explanation. And the most unpleasant thing here is not the refusal itself. The most unpleasant thing is its routine nature. As if this is just how it's supposed to be. You ask for something else, an old newspaper file, not issued. You ask for an early atlas, not found in the collection. You ask for a legal codex, a provincial map, a landholding catalog, census records, and again, the same thing. The wording changes, but the result does not. Before you is not an isolated failure. Before you is a corridor, where one door after another turns out to be locked. And the doors that are locked first and foremost are precisely those behind which lies everything oldest. Everything that could show what the world looked like before it was described by later textbooks. The strangest moment comes later, when you notice the boundary. Documents from the second half of the 19th century are often accessible. Newspapers, magazines, statistical collections, official correspondence, guidebooks, later maps. All of this can still be requested and read. But everything deeper, everything leading into the first half of the century and beyond, seems to hit an invisible wall. As if someone once drew a knife through history and left below only what they considered safe. And then the first thought appears in your head, one that's hard to get rid of. What if it's not about fragility or a lack of staff? What if the problem isn't with the library, but with the past itself? What if it's not a specific collection that's closed, but an entire zone of memory? And if that's the case, the next question becomes inevitable. Is this an accident or a pattern? One refusal can still be chalked up to confusion. 10 to bureaucracy. But when the same barrier surfaces in different archives, in different cities, and even in different countries, accident starts to look like too convenient a word. A researcher goes through catalogs and sees a repeating pattern. Everything related to earlier periods turns out to be either inaccessible or requires special clearance, or is listed as under perpetual processing. Meanwhile, materials from later times are presented without such hostile caution. The difference is felt almost physically. The official reasons sound reasonable. Old documents are more fragile. They need restoration. They are harder to catalog. There's a shortage of specialists, a shortage of money, a shortage of time. Individually, each explanation looks convincing. But the problem is that together they paint too neat a picture. Too often, ancient materials end up as if behind the same line. And the more such coincidences there are, the worse references to ordinary administrative disorder work. It's not about one archive or one library here. It's about the principle. If almost everywhere it's specifically the old documents that are poorly accessible, while later ones are already open, then it's not just about the condition of the paper. It means we're looking at a division by meaning. Something was seemingly separated from the modern researcher and placed under a special regime. Not necessarily with words, not necessarily with one order, but the result looks exactly like that. The past seems to have been divided into safe and dangerous. And then attention naturally shifts from the closed shelves to the open ones. Fine. Let's say some collections are unavailable. But what can be checked right now? What can be compared without clearance, without closed doors, without special permissions? The answer is obvious. One must look at books that have survived in different editions, at encyclopedias, at reference books, at those texts that themselves claim to be a map of knowledge of their era. And there, what awaits us is not a wall, but something much more disturbing: the disappearance of entire layers of meaning. An encyclopedia is not a random book. It's a concentrate of what an era considers known and worthy of a place in common knowledge. That's precisely why comparing editions sometimes works better than any archive. You open an early volume and see a world where a territory is described in detail, confidently, with lists of cities, trade routes, customs, administrative details. Then you open a later edition, and it's as if you're looking not at an abridged text, but at traces of someone's cleanup. The volume drops sharply. Specifics disappear. In place of a confident description, a fog appears. The most famous example in such debates is the article on Tartary. In old editions, it's not a random marginal note on the world. It's a large space written about seriously, as a reality deserving separate attention. There is geography, there are names, there is an internal logic, and later, almost emptiness. A few lines, vague formulations, a hint of a little studied region. And here, it's not just the reduction that catches you, it's the absence of a normal transition. The old picture isn't dismantled, refuted, or explained as outdated. It's as if it's simply swept away. This is an important psychological moment. When knowledge develops honestly, it argues with previous knowledge. It shows what the error was, where new information appeared, what changed in understanding. But here, a sense of a different process is created. Not an argument, but a replacement. Not a correction, but an erasure. As if the previous version was so troublesome that it was easier not to discuss it, but to reduce it to a safe minimum. And if this happens in an encyclopedia, An even heavier question immediately arises. Text can be cut by an editor's hand, but a map is different. A map either shows space or removes it. It either leaves cities and names or erases them. Thus, the next step in this story leads to where not just wording, but the very visible image of the world was altered. Old maps can strike the consciousness almost without words. A single glance is enough. Where later atlases show blurred space, early cartographers often left names, lines, cities, routes, landmarks. It doesn't look like fantasy in the margins. It looks like an attempt to organize the known world. And that's why it's especially strange to see how later the same territory begins to be presented far more poorly and vaguely. Not in one private sheet, not by one author, but in a whole series of later representations. Proponents of the official version put it simply. Old cartographers made mistakes. They passed on rumors, repeated others' inaccuracies, plotted cities that didn't exist. The explanation sounds convenient, but it has a weak spot. Maps weren't made by random dreamers. They were made by people whose work later formed the foundation of the entire European cartographic school. These authors could make mistakes, of course, but when an error supposedly covers too many elements, and then an entire layer of designations disappears without clear debate, doubt returns with renewed force. What's especially alarming is not the fact of discrepancies, but their direction. It's not chaos that disappears, it's richness that disappears. Space seems to become impoverished retroactively. Where structure was once seen, later they begin to speak of being poorly studied. Where names once stood, voids later appear. And this no longer looks like ordinary progress in accuracy, but like a change in the very framework of permissible knowledge. As if something was once known, then became inconvenient. And here, the question of mechanics inevitably arises. Who could carry out such an operation? Who even has the right to decide which descriptions, which maps, and which documents are deemed worthy of preservation, and which should fade into the shadows? The answer isn't hard to find. It's always the state. Ministries, archival commissions, scholarly committees. Those very dry structures that operate in the language of instructions. It's there, behind bureaucratic words about order and utility, that the story of the Great Revision begins. The mid-19th century, at first glance, looks like an era of rational order. States are growing. Bureaucracy is strengthening. Archives are being centralized. Collections are being described. Catalogs are being updated. All this can be presented as the victory of a modern system over old chaos. That's usually how it's presented. But if you look closer, behind this respectable facade, another story is visible. In many countries around the same time, processes are launched in which old documents begin to pass through the hands of officials who have received the right to decide what is worthy of memory and what is not. The pattern repeats with surprising clarity. First, the necessity of imposing order is declared. Then, collections are gathered, reviewed, rearranged, regrouped. After that comes the fateful fork. Some papers are deemed valuable. Others, superfluous, outdated, impractical, of no interest. And here, a neutral administrative reform turns into a quiet operation to alter the very composition of the past. Because all power ends up with the one who looks at an old paper and decides whether it lives on or not. What's especially alarming is the synchronicity. Russia, Britain, France, and other powers seem like different worlds, with their own interests and conflicts. But in the matter of archival reorganization, they suddenly move in almost the same rhythm: centralization, selection, disposal, destruction. And this happens precisely in the period after which many old descriptions of the world begin to disappear from reference books and maps. Too many coincidences for just bureaucratic fashion. The main point here isn't even the reforms themselves. The main point is the criteria. Who determined what was historically important? By what measures was what later formed the basis of official memory selected? And if the fate of thousands of documents depended on the signature of a local official or commission, then what we're looking at is no longer faceless archival routine. It's the point where the past first passes through the filter of power. And how this filter worked in practice is best seen in the language of justifications. There are words that sound almost harmless in archives: dilapidated, damaged, no longer relevant. On paper, they're just bureaucratic formulas. But if you think about it, it's precisely such words that could bury an entire layer of history. They're short, convenient, require no detailed explanations, and that's why they're especially dangerous. Almost anything can be hidden behind them. From old censuses to land plans, from ledgers to private collections. It's enough to write that a document is in poor condition or no longer needed for current affairs, and its fate is sealed. But here an unpleasant crack appears in the official logic. Paper from past centuries was often made differently from later mass-produced paper. Many old sheets, under normal storage conditions, last surprisingly long. They remain legible, hold ink, keep their shape. So when vast arrays are sent for destruction under the same brush, supposedly due to dilapidation, you can't help but wonder, what exactly was called dilapidated? Actually crumbling collections? Or everything that simply became inconvenient to keep at hand, alive and accessible? The human layer of this story is even more powerful. Not all archivists were fanatics of the new version of the past. Many probably just followed orders. They were given a circular. They made marks, burned, disposed of, sent for scrap, unwilling to risk their position and salary. And in this silence, there's something especially terrifying. History isn't always broken by a loud decree from a podium. Sometimes it's cut by small movements of people who themselves don't fully understand the scale of what they're involved in. Hence the feeling of a template. The same formulas, the same reasons, the same percentages of destruction in the most varied places. As if they not only permitted the purge, but also suggested in advance how to justify it. But even that, it seems, wasn't enough. Because the Chancellery removes what passes through commissions. But what to do with what already lies in libraries, universities, city collections, and might outlive the circulars? Here another tool enters the story. Cruder, faster, more reliable. Fire. If you line up reports of library fires in the mid-19th century, the picture becomes overwhelming on its own. One fire can still be considered an accident. Two, a string of misfortunes. But when, in a short historical span, archives, university libraries, city collections, old manuscript collections burn, and most often it's the ancient collections that suffer, accident starts to sound too lazy. A feeling arises that fire becomes not a catastrophe, but a convenient conclusion to work already begun by the chancelleries. Of course, there are rational explanations: heating, unsafe lighting, dense construction, a lack of fire safety measures. All of this could indeed have increased the risk. But the problem, once again, lies in selectivity. Why were collections of old documents so often among the casualties? Why did manuscripts, maps, early holdings disappear, while more recent materials sometimes survived better? Why did the fire seem to have a particular fondness for those parts of memory that were already more frequently subject to access restrictions? There is another detail that makes this topic so persistent. In some cases, contemporaries mentioned that the fire looked strange, too rapid a spread, multiple points of origin, a moment that was too convenient. Of course, years later, this can be dismissed as rumor. But even without them, a troubling sequence emerges. First, documents are declared obsolete or fragile. Then, some holdings fail to arrive during transport. Then, something disappears during cataloging. And then, fire finishes off the remnants. Not a single accident, but a series of blows in one direction. In such a narrative, a fire is terrifying not only because it destroys paper, it settles questions. After a fire, there's no longer a need to argue about access, about a text's provenance, about who and why moved a document to a restricted collection. Ash does not argue. Ash demands nothing. And when you understand this, the next step in the story becomes especially important. Because destruction is inevitably followed by replacement. An empty space rarely remains empty. It is almost always filled with a new, already approved version. Erasing old documents is only half the job. The past is truly changed only when a new canon appears in place of the vanished sources. This is precisely what makes the mid-19th century such a suspicious turning point. Almost immediately after waves of revisions and losses, major comprehensive works begin to be published. New encyclopedias, legal codes, histories of states, publications that don't just recount facts, but establish the norm for how the past should henceforth be seen. And this norm gradually takes on the appearance of being scientific, rigorous, and definitive. It's important here not to oversimplify. Not every author of such a canon was a conscious falsifier. On the contrary, many likely worked honestly with what they were given. They traveled to archives, read selected papers, constructed a coherent picture, and believed they were reconstructing history in the best possible way. But that's the trap. If the original body of sources has already been purged, then even the most conscientious historian will assemble a version limited from the outset. They are not lying. They simply cannot see what disappeared before them. This is how a new stability is born. Old oddities cease to be discussed. Discrepancies between early and late sources are pushed to the periphery. Controversial material disappears from the general field, and in its place appears a smooth, coherent, convenient history. Not necessarily false in every detail, but already constructed so as not to let inconvenient threads escape. And when this new version gains authoritative status, resisting it becomes increasingly difficult. Because now it lives not only in books, but in institutions. The most powerful weapon of any new canon is not the police or censorship. Its true weapon is habit. When an entire generation reads the same texts as having no alternative, they begin to seem like the natural backdrop of reality. This is how history leaves the archives and enters minds. And so, the next chapter of this chain unfolds not among catalogs and holdings, but in classrooms, lecture halls, and mandatory education curricula. School seems a peaceful place, but when it comes to the memory of entire peoples, it is perhaps one of the most powerful mechanisms of power. Archives are accessible to few. Old editions are read by a handful. Maps are compared by enthusiasts. But a textbook passes through millions of hands. This is why, following archival reforms and the creation of a new historical canon, the next logical step is educational reform, where a child is given a single picture of the past from an early age. Debate over sources is no longer necessary. Most will never see the originals. The finished version is enough for them. This is the strength of the system. It doesn't have to ban every alternative thought. It is enough to make the official version the only familiar one. Several generations in a row grow up with the same logic. Here is antiquity. Here is the Middle Ages. Here are the proper states. Here are the recognized borders. Here are the canonical names. Everything is laid out, numbered, approved. And everything that doesn't fit into this scheme goes into the realm of oddities, eccentricities, marginal hypotheses, not because it was honestly refuted, but because people were simply never introduced to it. The most important thing here is the speed of forgetting. One generation may still remember old books on their grandparents' shelves, stories about strange maps, inconsistencies in family papers. The second generation already perceives this as the junk of the past. The third doesn't even understand what is being talked about. This is how memory substitution works, not through total prohibition, but through erosion. Through raising people for whom an alternative picture of the world is not forbidden, it is simply unthinkable. And then a question arises that makes this entire story truly dangerous. If the authorities, scholarly commissions, and school curricula were so persistent in cementing a new version of the past, what exactly did the old version hinder? What was in those documents that were deemed superfluous? What did those maps, censuses, blueprints, genealogies, and ancient descriptions contain that made it easier to remove them than to include them in an honest debate? Here we approach the most sensitive point of the entire story. There is no direct answer. That is precisely the main problem. When documents are destroyed, we cannot open and read them. But indirect traces still allow us to outline the scope of what might have been deemed too dangerous for the new historical construct. The first layer is geographical. Old maps and early reference works sometimes show a world that appears more dense, interconnected, and structured than the later version of the same space. If such a description didn't fit the new narrative, it was easier to declare it a misconception and remove it from circulation. The second layer is technical. In old books, mentions of knowledge occasionally surface that are later presented in more recent works as recent discoveries. Construction techniques, compositions, engineering solutions, information about crafts. By itself, this proves nothing, but collectively, it creates an uncomfortable thought. Perhaps part of the past was not more primitive than modernity, but simply organized differently. And then, the destruction of old sources meant not only editing history, but severing the memory of the practical capabilities of the former world. The third layer: population, land, origin. Censuses, land plans, court records, genealogical books. All of this is incredibly sensitive material. Such documents show who lived in a territory, who owned the land, where people migrated from, what connections bound families, and how power was distributed before later reforms. If a new political construct wanted to present the past as cleaner, simpler, and more convenient, these very papers became the most dangerous. They resist a beautiful legend because they speak in the dry language of fact. And then the scale of the possible loss begins to become clear. We might not be talking about a few disputed episodes or rare exotic maps. We could be talking about entire layers of reality that interfered with a new scheme of the origins of states, peoples, technologies, and borders. But if this isn't just the local history of one empire, then the next step is inevitable. We must look wider, much wider, because such processes surface all too often far beyond Europe. Once you start looking not at one country, but at the world map as a whole, the alarming logic repeats itself. In one place, it's called archive reform. In another, restoring order after a war. In a third, suppressing a rebellion. In a fourth, rescuing and evacuating ancient collections for safekeeping. The wordings are different. The political context is different. But the outcome is remarkably similar. Old documents disappear. Ancient archives are broken up. Manuscripts are taken away, end up in closed collections, are lost in transit, perish in fires, or simply cease to exist in public memory. This is where the theme of global synchronicity emerges. Not in the sense of a fantastic secret headquarters directing everything simultaneously, but in the sense of a common historical turning point. The mid-19th century appears as a moment when power in many regions of the world began to take control not only of territory and population, but also of the very memory of the past in a new way. European dynasties, colonial administrations, centralizing states, new scientific institutions, all of them, for different reasons, were interested in making the past orderly, readable, and politically safe. This doesn't prove the existence of a single conspiracy in the primitive sense, but it also no longer allows us to dismiss it with the word coincidence. Too much points in the same direction. First, old papers disappear. Then new historical canons are published. Then schools cement them as the only normal ones. And almost everywhere, the process coincides with the same period of rapid global restructuring. As if humanity wasn't just modernized, as if its memory apparatus was simultaneously swapped out. And yet, a complete purge seems to have failed. Otherwise, this topic would have died long ago. But it returns again and again, through accidental discoveries, early editions, auction appearances, strange family archives, forgotten translations, monastic repositories. This means that even after a major cleanup, gaps remained in the system. Small ones, uneven ones, but sufficient to keep asking questions. And that means the final period in this story has not yet been written. The most unpleasant thing for any system of control is not open rebellion, but the small, stubborn remnants of what couldn't be destroyed. In this context, those remnants become private libraries, rare reprints, monastic collections, family papers, forgotten translations, and accidental finds that literally crawl out of the walls of old houses. Sometimes it's one book, sometimes a map, sometimes a manuscript that lay for decades where no commission, no official, and no fire ever reached. And each such fragment on its own may seem trivial, but together they provide the most important thing. They prevent history from being completely cemented shut. Of course, restoring everything is already impossible. Too much has been burned. Too much has passed through someone else's selection. Too often we are left only with traces, not the thing itself, but its reflection, mention, retelling, a later copy. But even that is enough to understand. The past doesn't have to be as smooth as textbooks made it. It was more complex, sharper, perhaps far richer in connections and meanings than what we are offered as the final version. And so, the main work here is not blindly replacing one dogma with another. The main work is to compare, to juxtapose, to catch inconsistencies, and not to be afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. That is why this entire story is important not only for lovers of alternative versions. It is important for anyone who wants to understand how the memory of a civilization is created in the first place. Who decides what we should remember? Who decides what counts as a mistake and what as canon? Why does one book disappear while another gains unquestionable status? Why are some maps ridiculed while others are printed in millions of copies? As long as these questions are asked, the past is not yet sealed shut. As long as there are people who compare editions, check catalogs, and read between the lines, the great silence of the archives no longer looks absolute. Let's stop here for today. If this topic has caught your interest, subscribe, like, and be sure to hit the bell. In the next episode, we will move from the general scheme of the Purge to the old maps themselves. What exactly was shown on them? Why these images so irritate the official version? And which details are still kept out of mainstream conversation? Because sometimes, one forgotten map says more about the past than a whole cabinet full of later textbooks.